Today, we discuss hardline anti-abortion bills being passed in American states. None of the legislation has been put into effect, but it is part of an attempt to overturn a woman's legal right to an abortion that is enshrined in US law. And the vocal training aimed at helping trans women find their voices.
Mr. Marsh, Mr. McClendon, Mr. Melson, Mr. Orr, Mr. Price, Mr. Reed.
Abby Crane remembers that it was sweltering as she sat in the packed gallery overlooking the Alabama State House on Tuesday the 14th of May, peering down at the chamber through a pane of glass.
Mr. Shelnut.
I mean, I truly try my best to keep my reporter glasses on during interviews and all that kind of stuff, but this one particularly stung. It was really emotional. I think there were tears on both sides. They read off the votes and it was kind of unceremonious and abrupt.
25 ayes, 6 nays, 1 abstention. House Bill 314 passes.
Mr. President.
Yes, Senator Chamberlain.
There was no outcry afterwards, and everyone just left the chamber. And, you know, I watched as the men kind of shook hands and fist bumped and smiled and congratulated each other.
The almost celebratory mood among the 25 white men who had just voted to pass the most restrictive abortion ban in the US shocked the journalist.
I couldn't help but just be a woman in that moment, and it truly hurt because there were so many women that spoke up about their experiences and what this would do to them, and it just seemed like a direct affront, and it hurt.
This bill is not about pro-life or the right to life. This bill is about control.
AL.com, the website that Crane works for, asked women to send in letters responding to the decision. They received 200 and published every one.
Politics over education and men over women.
And now I'm 18 next year, and I will be voting for a person who cares about my life more than the Alabama woman I know would have and did do everything in their power to make sure that our state treated every person with or without a uterus with compassion.
It's an outpouring now bubbling up in other states as this extreme legislation spreads across the country.
Keep abortion safe and legal.
Women are being made second-class citizens in this country by President Trump. Women are being demeaned.
From Ohio and Kentucky to Arkansas and Mississippi, North Dakota and beyond. These so-called heartbeat bills were pioneered by a woman once seen as so fringe that even pro-life groups did not embrace her. But it seems that Janet Porter's extreme ideas have found their political moment in Donald Trump's America. From The Guardian, I'm Anushka Astana. Today in Focus, Janet Porter and a crusade to outlaw abortion in America.
I first came into contact with Janet Porter when I was writing a story about a fetal heartbeat bill, so-called, in Iowa in the spring of 2018.
Jessica Glenza is a health reporter at Guardian US.
And Janet Porter came to my attention as a person who claimed to have authored this bill and claimed to have a meeting with Mike Pence. And so that really threw up an exclamation point for me.
So how did you start to find out about her?
So here in the United States, there are civil rights groups that track people who say things that are inflammatory, for example, about the LGBT community. And Janet Porter started really showing up a lot on these lists. In addition, I went through the IRS tax filings for her group, which is a nonprofit. And so I started to learn about her work. Her work started in the 1990s when she worked for Ohio Right to Life.
We are working towards one simple and sacred goal: saving and protecting innocent human life.
So that's a very establishment anti-abortion group, a group that's been working for a long time to chip away at abortion rights.
So how did you get in touch with her? and get an interview.
I got in touch with her through her organization, and I was able to set up an interview with her. We met at a house in Ohio. It was her house. She prefers that I don't disclose the location because she had an incident in the 1990s when her Porsche was set on fire, so she has some safety concerns. It was a fairly normal suburban house in a development like a gated community, but there was no security. And when I arrived, the first thing that she asked me was, is it okay if I videotape this interview?
Ooh, I'd prefer to not be in the shot if that's okay.
Kind of need it that way so that we have proof of what was said, what was asked, and...
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
That's not a normal feature of most interviews. And one of the first things that struck me was there was a number of other people in the house, but they wouldn't give me their names or identify who they were, although they clearly worked with Porter and had done some work flying internationally, flying around the United States to lobby against abortion rights. When I arrived at her house, one of the first things that struck me was there was this display of red roses and It's a Boy and It's a Girl balloons.
Who are the flowers from?
Lots of different people.
Where was the display?
It was right in the main window of the front room, so it was very prominent, and I think it was set up to show how many supporters Janet had, because one of the ways that she got attention for this bill over the years, she lobbied for it for 10 years, was by sending red roses to legislators. So she had a real penchant for headline-grabbing stunts, and this is one of the things that she did.
We rented a plane to fly over the State House. When we first introduced the bill, we had 5,000 red heart Mylar balloons that we delivered with the messages from their constituents. We had 2,200 roses on another Valentine's Day that we delivered to the Senate.
And so when she finally was successful in having this bill passed, her supporters sent her red roses.
It must be quite unusual. You work for The Guardian, not a publication that would generally be sympathetic to views like Janet Porter's. What was it like when you met her?
Janet Porter was extremely polite when I met her, so we walked in and she shook my hand and offered water and coffee and...
You want a glass of water or something?
Sure. Even cookies, which she had just baked. At the same time, I knew that some of her views were very extreme.
Do you really believe that Christians are facing the same kind of attacks here in America as Jews did in Nazi Germany?
Well, what's interesting is, and I'm not saying we're gassing anybody just yet, but I will say this.
I'll give you an example. One of the things that she wrote an article about was on a website called WorldNet Daily. It's known for hosting conspiracy theories, and she wrote that the extreme climate events happening in the United States and around the world are not the result of climate change, but of expanding gay rights. So,
oh my God.
Here was a person who was being kind and polite to us, but whose views were really at odds with how most Americans view gay marriage at this point and how many Americans view abortion rights.
Tell me about her upbringing.
Janet Porter was raised as a Lutheran outside of Cleveland, Ohio. She would have been in school around the time that Roe versus Wade was decided. That's the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision decided in 1973 that legalized abortion across the United States.
Did she tell you about what she felt about Roe v. Wade?
Sure. She describes a scene in an auditorium when she was in school in which there was two people brought in to talk to the class, and one was a Planned Parenthood representative who described why women need bodily autonomy and why abortion rights are important to elevate women in society and keep them as equal members of society. And there was another person who represented the opposite side of the abortion debate, who she said came to the school and showed students pictures of fetuses in garbage bags and argued that abortion is murder.
And I still remember it as a 10th grader, not really clued in on what abortion was. But when I saw the pictures of the babies, the dead babies in a garbage bag, there were no words that could make that right. You know, you can talk about choice and women's rights and, you know, all the different slogans you can think of, but you're looking at a child who was never given a choice. And that was in 10th grade. I was 15 years old. Okay. My life has never been the same.
So Porter says this cemented her view of abortion, even though it was not a big part of her upbringing. It was not something that was a critical issue in her household.
And did she say why? I mean, there are lots of these videos and images around. What made her so vocal as a result of that?
Janet Porter believes what she's doing is right.
If you see a theme developing here, I have a very strong affinity to defend the innocent. And that's really what was at the heart of the Heartbeat Bill as well. All these innocent children who are facing a horrific, brutal death by abortion. And we're now recognizing the universally recognized indicator that is being used in hospitals around the world. That is a heartbeat.
So she becomes inspired about this idea that abortion is a terrible thing. What happens when she becomes an adult?
When she becomes an adult, she begins to lobby for Ohio Right to Life, and that's a very establishment anti-abortion group that pushes for incremental legislation that makes obtaining an abortion onerous. Now, she worked for Ohio Right to Life for about 10 years, and she then took a new position in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It was really the height of discussion in the United States about gay marriage. And so Janet Porter took this up as her next issue and constructed a campaign around gay conversion therapy. She then moved back to Ohio, and this was when she really started to lobby for these 6-week abortion bans for the so-called fetal heartbeat bill. In about 2010, decided that it was important to push for an outright ban, to overturn Roe versus Wade. And this is where we really see the genesis of the bills that are sweeping the country today, almost a decade later. When she started pushing this legislation, it was really rare to see an abortion ban passed in the United States. The reason why is because the U.S. Supreme Court already had precedent that said a woman has a right to obtain an abortion, a constitutional right to obtain an abortion. And so people felt like this is a law that's going to be easily overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court and potentially take the rest of our legislation with it. So even though other anti-abortion groups were pushing for changes that would make it difficult for a woman to obtain an abortion, Janet Porter was really on the fringe, pushing to have a complete ban put into place.
And it's interesting because it's kind of obvious that Janet Porter would be someone who was disliked by people on the left, but she was also disliked by people on the establishment right. Was there something in the way that she was behaving that's particularly alienated them?
I think there's a couple reasons that Janet Porter started to move outside of establishment circles. And one was the fact that there was an intellectual disagreement about the strategy she was using to limit women's abortion rights. I think the other reason is because her lobbying tactics could be quite divisive at times. One of the ones that really sticks with me is more than once she had a fetus testify in utero via sonogram. Now, this is a really unusual tactic.
I just do not understand how that works.
Essentially, it was just a sonogram of a fetus with a beating heart, and that, to her, symbolized the reason this bill needed to go forward.
She called that as a witness?
Yes, and she described it as testimony.
Look closely at this ultrasound, and you can see a fetus in the womb with a beating heart. Pro-life advocates are using these images to try to convince lawmakers in Ohio to support a measure that's been dubbed the Heartbeat Bill. Janet Folger Porter is the bill's architect.
So, what is a heartbeat bill, and what is Janet Porter's role in that?
A heartbeat bill is effectively an abortion ban that starts around 6 weeks into a pregnancy. And I just want to take a moment to point out that although she's called it a fetal heartbeat bill, a pregnancy is not referred to as a fetus until about 10 weeks. It's actually an embryo at the stage that this bill bans abortions, and that it's not a heart the way that you or I would think of the organ that we have. It's a microscopic collection of tissues that has a flutter to it, a throb. And there's no circulatory system at this stage. So it's a bit of mishmash of medical terminology. The strategy of this kind of bill being that it's going to stop the vast majority of abortions because most women don't know they're pregnant at this point. It's not my understanding that she has gone to each of these states and lobbied. It's sort of like it just caught on, if that makes sense.
Talk me through all the states across the United States where versions of this law have shown up over the last several years.
So around 2010, Janet Porter starts working on a bill to ban abortion at 6 weeks. So she first introduces it in Ohio in 2011. At that time, it is not supported and it doesn't pass. But she manages to get it passed twice more in Ohio by the legislature, and it's vetoed twice by an anti-abortion governor.
As he promised, Governor Kasich has vetoed the so-called heartbeat bill. That measure included one of the most far-reaching abortion restrictions in the country.
During this time, North Dakota passes a fetal heartbeat bill, and it's signed by the governor.
The Bismarck Tribune says North Dakota's governor signed 3 anti-abortion measures into law yesterday. One bans abortion as soon as a heartbeat can be detected.
It never goes into effect because it's stopped by a court. The next state to pass a fetal heartbeat bill or a 6-week abortion ban is Iowa.
Another development in the state of Iowa, Ed, this week, the governor there imposed a 6-week abortion ban.
Strictest in the country. Again, another
This is a place that most Americans think of as moderate, and that's where I became aware of Janet Porter. That would have been the spring of 2018.
Why are the bills being knocked down?
Her bills were being knocked down because Roe versus Wade gave women the constitutional right to obtain an abortion up to the point that a fetus can survive outside of the womb. That's roughly 24 weeks. It's called a viability standard. And so a 6-week abortion ban is far before that standard, and that's why these laws were being knocked down.
So they're not down, but they just keep coming.
So we see these bills in Kentucky.
Senate Bill 9 bans abortions after a fetal heartbeat is detected.
Mississippi.
And in Mississippi, the governor signs a bill banning most abortions as soon as the baby's heartbeat is detected.
Georgia.
Well, Georgia has passed one of the most restrictive abortion policies in the country.
And then Alabama, which is, I think, where it really came to the attention of a lot of people.
Yesterday, Alabama lawmakers passed a bill banning nearly all abortions. That is either an overreach by the Alabama GOP or some pretty intense viral marketing for the new season of Handmaid's Tale.
Now, the Alabama bill is a little bit different. It's not a bill that bans abortion at 6 weeks. It's a bill that bans abortion from the moment of conception entirely. And so I think that is where you really see the culmination of this strategy to move from something that's incremental to a total abortion ban. After Alabama, Missouri passes a bill through its legislature.
Today, Missouri became the latest state to pass a bill banning abortions after 8 weeks.
The governor has yet to sign that bill, but we're expecting him to do so. So we're at this point where we see bill after bill passing through state legislatures, and now Louisiana.
I mean, I watched something recently in which it showed the states that were one by one doing this, and it looked like the American map starting to light up, and it felt quite scary. What is the chance of this undermining Roe v. Wade?
I think the important thing to remember about the laws that are passing across the United States is that they are looking at the long game. These laws are not meant to immediately ban abortion. They will not immediately stop abortions in the states where they're passing. What they will do is present a challenge where 5 to 10 years down the road, as they move through lower courts and then appeals courts, and then are presented to the Supreme Court as an opportunity to reconsider Roe versus Wade, that's where you're going to see some really important cases potentially come before the U.S. Supreme Court. There's no guarantee that it takes up one of these cases, but the passage of a large number of these laws makes it more likely.
And what do we need to know about the Supreme Court that could make a difference?
So the Supreme Court is a 9-judge body that until recently had 4 liberal members, 4 conservative members, and 1 swing vote, and that was U.S. Justice Anthony Kennedy. Now, Kennedy was a conservative judge in many ways and made many conservative decisions, but one of the most important decisions he made was a case in 1992 which reaffirmed Roe versus Wade, a woman's right to obtain an abortion. So for many years, as Justice Kennedy sat on the court, it was seen as imprudent to send extreme cases up to higher courts because they would be struck down. When Justice Kennedy retired, he was replaced by a Trump nominee, Brett Kavanaugh.
The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Brett Kavanaugh is seen as a conservative judge, and so you have this rebalancing of the court where suddenly, instead of 4 liberal, 4 conservative, and a swing voter on abortion, you have 4 liberal and 5 conservative. And that's all it takes is for 5 justices to vote in favor of restricting abortion. And so that's where you really start to see the concern from people who want to maintain abortion rights in the United States.
That is absolutely terrifying because essentially it sounds like if the US Supreme Court makes the decision to look at one of these cases, the numbers are there to change the course of abortion policy across the country. I mean, presumably you've been speaking to a lot of women who feel extremely strongly about this. What are you hearing?
It's an extremely emotional situation for women in the United States right now. A lot of the testimony on these laws passing in state legislatures is tearful. Women are crying, women are protesting, women are upset. It's extremely difficult for many people to see something that their mothers or their grandmothers had worked to enshrine in law suddenly be endangered. This is a right that women in their 30s grew up with, something that was almost taken for granted as something that would always be there. And so to see it suddenly come up in question is extremely trying.
Jessica, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Jessica Glenza. You can read all her health coverage at theguardian.com. Coming up, why some trans women work with speech therapists to alter their vocal style. Now, journalist Serena Daniari on how some trans women are using voice feminization training to avoid getting misgendered in day-to-day interactions.
Trans women especially are held to this unrealistic standard of how we should sound and how we should blend in. And I think given our bodies and our limitations, some of these standards are unrealistic. But also, you know, we live in a society where violence against trans people is very real. So one aspect to wanting to feminize your voice is certainly wanting to be perceived by others as feminine, but also the other aspect is to be able to move through the world and through public spaces safely and avoiding harassment and discrimination. So I sort of wanted to explore how trans women relate to and experience their voices. When trans women undergo a male puberty, testosterone stretches out our vocal cords and essentially deepens our voices. So we can begin hormones and estrogen therapy to feminize other aspects of our body, but once those changes have occurred to your vocal cords, there's no real way to change your voice unless you want to do vocal training or vocal surgeries. I reached out to Christy Block, who is a speech pathologist in New York, and she connected me with Lillian Primrose, who is a trans woman who's been undergoing voice training for about a year now. This first sample is a recording of Lillian's first consultation.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow.
And the second example is a recording of her 11th session, 7 months after training began.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow.
It's sort of a combination of vocal techniques, vocal exercises, and vocal warm-ups, like lip trills and working to read different sentences while maintaining a feminine voice. But there's also sort of a talk therapy aspect to it, the emotional aspect of the voice and which environments the client feels comfortable using their feminine voice versus which environments the client doesn't feel as comfortable. Christy, who's the speech pathologist I spoke with, explained that a lot of her clients are not comfortable doing vocal practices in their feminine voices at their apartments because they're afraid their roommates are going to hear, or they feel self-conscious. So some of her clients go to the car to do their vocal exercises. So part of it is also just logistically helping the client figure out where they can do their exercises. So Lillian had explained to me that throughout her transition, prior to undergoing vocal training, she would put off phone calls because she would get misgendered on the phone. She would get called sir, or the person on the other end would use the wrong pronouns. So I think the moment for her that it actually hit her how much progress she had been making in terms of feminizing her voice was when she had made a phone call to update her bank information, and she was gendered correctly by the bank teller who didn't know who Lillian was and had no idea about her gender history. I think because voice training is such a gradual process and the voice changes slowly and slowly and slowly, sometimes it's difficult to be able to tell how much progress you're making until you have one of those like aha moments.
That's it for today. My thanks to Jessica Glenza, Abby Crane, Erin Durkin, and Serena Daniari. Today's episode was produced by Maithili Rao, India Rakison, Gary Marshall, and Claudia Stobbart. Sound design was by Axel Kukoutier. The executives are Nicole Jackson and Phil Maynard. We'll be back tomorrow.